I did this song once before, and it was a long time ago. But when Mark said he was going to do the series on trials and tribulations, it popped into my head, and along with a couple others, but this was one of the ones that I really liked. And I messaged Heather last weekend when I realized that it was going to be her weekend to do her testimony. And I was like, okay, I've got this list of ones that I'm considering doing. Are there any that you would like, that you prefer? And this is the one that she picked, and I was really happy with it because I like it a lot. We pray for blessings, we pray for peace, comfort for family, protection while we sleep. We pray for healing, for prosperity. We pray for your mighty hand to ease our suffering, and all the while you hear each spoken need. You love us way too much to give us lesser things. 'Cause what if your blessings come through raindrops? What if your healing comes through tears? What if 1,000 sleepless nights are what it takes to know you're near? What if trials of this life are your mercies in disguise? We pray for wisdom, your voice to hear. We cry in anger when we cannot feel you near.
again.
Much, Mary. Thank you very much. I am going to get my clicker back here too. How about that Berry County scene? Is that cool? I tell you, if you're a Dogwood person, this is your week, right? This is your week right there. That's nice. You can just go about anywhere in Berry County and find that scene right now. You can see God at work in nature, the Bible says, and you truly can right now. It's a good time to live in the Ozarks. Really is. We've been doing this trial and tribulation series for some time now, and I've got a few more weeks to go probably with it, but today we're going to, I've announced that previously that I have a special guest today, that my daughter Heather is going to come here today and talk about my grandson Tate. And by the way, there's Children's Church. If you guys want to go, you're welcome to take advantage of that. But I want to say before we begin that the reason for us doing this is not to seek any kind of sympathy or pity for us on our part of it, or even for Tate. But our goal is to show you how God has brought us through this thus far. That is really the reason that we're doing this today. And I do that with the hope that it will help you when you go through the valley and the fire. Most of us will have hardship at some time in our life, and maybe today will inspire you in how you can do that. So I'm going to invite Heather and Jeannie both, my wife, come up here today, and I'm going to ask her some questions and let them tell the story, because they've lived it as much as anybody has. I'm going to give Heather, we got one channel on her camera, and I'm going to give her this channel so he can get a recording of this, but I'm going to give her this mic. And me and Jeannie will get another one here. I'll give you that one.
Oh, thanks.
Give you this one. And I'm going to ask her some questions here. We're going to turn the chair where I can see a little bit. Turn yours in just a little bit, Jeannie.
And Tate has been recovering from a cold, so he might be extra vocal today.
Yeah, he might be. Tate is here today.
Yeah, he's in the front.
Here in just a minute on that. We got a little feedback here too, so I'm going to kill this speakers here. They want to pick up mics pretty bad, so we'll shoot them out right there. That's better. That'll help.
Do you have the clicker?
So I want to begin by saying, are you nervous?
Clicker.
Huh?
A little.
A little bit nervous? What did I do with the clicker?
Yeah, I don't know.
It's on my, I lost my clicker. Here we go. There you go. We're going to get it together here. All right, she says she's a little bit nervous. She can relate how I feel every Sunday.
How do I do this?
Click right there. This one right here, right there. There you go.
There we go.
So, I'm going to ask them some questions, as I said, and let her just them tell the story, because they've really lived it. I guess I want to begin. Tell us how all this started and how you really had no idea that Tate had any medical problems before he was born. And you didn't know that, right?
Right. So we didn't have any indication that anything was wrong with Tate. I had a somewhat normal pregnancy. I did have extra fluid. I was retaining extra fluid, so I did go in to be induced, just like probably a lot of you in this room have had your babies by being induced. There was one part of my pregnancy that they thought I was high risk, so we did some extra testing. We actually did genetic testing and all of that. Everything came back normal. I remember the doctor actually saying, "Your baby's fine, everything's fine." So yeah, I wasn't expecting anything to happen. During my delivery though, or early on in the delivery, I went to the hospital and I was supposed to be induced, but I was actually already in labor. And so what happened was, they hooked the fetal monitor to me and they noticed that Tate's heart rate was going down. Like every time I'd have a contraction, his heart rate was lowering. So I wasn't there very long and they turned it into a non-emergent emergency C-section. It wasn't like, oh, they had to rush me, but within about 5 or 10 minutes, they had me set up for a C-section. But again, that didn't really scare me because a lot of people in here have had C-sections. That's very normal for something to kind of change in the delivery room, and they decided to do a C-section instead. So Tate was born, the NICU team was there, they checked him out, everything looked good. We went to the floor with him, everything was normal, except I couldn't get him to eat well, he wasn't latching, there was different things going on like that. I thought I had the world's best baby because he did not cry. He was just so perfect, slept all the time. So they were starting to talk about discharge, and I didn't think that he was eating correctly, so I asked to be kept another day. When they started listening to me and trying to help me feed him, they realized that it wasn't right either, so they put a feeding tube in his nose, and during his first feeding, the nurse was talking to me, and she looked over and said, "What are you doing, baby?" And I looked over, and his head was just like ticking to the side over and over. And so she grabbed his bassinet and just took him out of the room. And I looked at Chris, and I said, "That was a seizure." So they sent him straight to the NICU right then to do testing and said, we're going to run a bunch of tests on him, and then we'll come get you here in a little bit and you'll be able to see him. And that was in the afternoon. I wasn't actually able to see him until probably it seemed like midnight. It might have been more like 10 o'clock, but it was a long time that I hadn't got any updates. Whenever they did finally call my room, they said that they had taken him for an MRI, and during that, he stopped breathing and turned blue. So I'm in the hospital, my baby's somewhere else in the hospital, and he had coded, and I had no idea. So they intubated him, and whenever I did finally get to the NICU, or my baby went from this, he was healthy, we were all good, and then whenever I saw him the very next time, this is what he looked like. So I remember they finally let me go down and see him. It was the middle of the night. There was a doctor, very monotone, droning on and on about all the different kinds of seizures and how they can be caused. Sometimes it's infection, sometimes it's metabolic or genetic, and all of these things. And it's the middle of the night, and I just had surgery, and I'm really, really tired. And I just thought, why is he telling me all this? Do some tests. He probably has a fever, infection. He had a seizure. We'll fix it. We'll move on. So the very next day, I started realizing that it wasn't just one seizure. He was having lots of seizures. I didn't realize that right away. And so on day 4 of his life, he was being put on a helicopter to fly to St. Louis Children's because Springfield did not feel comfortable with him. I sent Chris on ahead to St. Louis. They didn't want us to fly with him because I had just had surgery. So I sent Chris ahead. I didn't want Tate to be alone in St. Louis. So Chris was there when Tate landed. Me and my mom stayed in Springfield so that we could load him on the plane. And then we took off in the middle of the night to meet them up there. Driving into St. Louis Children's was a whole different ball game in the middle of the night. I don't know if you guys have been there, but it's a lot bigger than Cox and Mercy. Wow. And yeah. So I remember seeing all these skyscrapers and thinking, where is my baby? My baby is somewhere in there and I have no idea. And so it was just kind of a weird feeling. But anyway, around that time, whenever we were getting to St. Louis, I still didn't think anything was severely wrong. I just thought that I've worked in medicine long enough that I know a lot of stuff can be treated by medicine or cured or something, and I really just thought that it would be something simple. The NICU really didn't even scare me because a lot of people go to the NICU and come out and live very normal, long lives, so it still wasn't something. I still didn't, grasp the gravity of the situation at that point. But I did get on Facebook at that time, and I started asking for prayers. And I told everybody that Tate had 3 things that he was dealing with, that he was having trouble eating, that he was not breathing well, and that he was having seizures. And so I guess a big part of this is to point out that 4 years later, Tate still cannot eat by mouth. He still can't breathe well. Like, I have his ventilator here today because he's had a cold and he's not really breathing the best, and he still has hundreds of seizures a day.
I guess I would add to that, when we talk a lot about this, the element of prayer in this, and answered prayer, and whatever, and we believe that God heals people all the time. But we also know that sometimes he does not choose to heal. And we've got to accept that sometimes. I think of Paul asked 3 times to have the thorn in the flesh removed. And God said, no, my grace is sufficient for you. You'll have to walk through that, Paul. So sometimes God does not always answer prayer the way we want it answered. And you've got to realize that sometimes. I'll never give up and never quit praying for healing. But I also know that sometimes you have to walk through the fire. And you have to be prepared for that. And, I can give you an even greater example. Jesus himself prayed a prayer that did not get answered. The night before he was crucified, he went to the Garden of Gethsemane and he said, Father, if it be thy will, take this cup from me, this crucifixion, take it from me. Well, it wasn't. The next day, he was crucified. So, as a Christian, we have to keep in mind, we don't quit praying, but we also realize that God is sovereign and makes the decisions, and we walk in that faith. So that needs to be pointed out as she talks about that very thing. And the next question I would ask you is, can you tell us how you felt when you finally realized what was going on and his condition was actually revealed to you?
Yeah, so we walked around St. Louis probably blind for several weeks. I look back now and it's kind of funny. I just still had no idea how bad things were.
I remember telling her over and over again, I'm always an optimist, and I remember saying, Heather, I work at school. We have kids that have seizures. It happens. I've had a child with their head in my lap having a seizure. We'll be okay. We can do this. And we just kept trying to figure out how to make the best of it. But like she said, at no time were we thinking, we thought this was something that could be fixed. We were just like, this is going to be fixed. It's not a problem. We got this.
Yeah, so I was Googling, just trying to figure out what was going on. At first, I thought it's just a seizure. Then I thought it's just seizures. And I remember this one time walking through the campus and telling Mom, I think Tate has epilepsy. And, we looked up that word and we're like, what is epilepsy? Again, a lot of people have epilepsy. There's probably people in this church or watching the recording that have epilepsy that really doesn't have it to Tate's degree. But the day that he was diagnosed, we weren't really expecting a diagnosis. It's not like the doctor said, we're going to have a meeting, like you need to be here in attendance, you need to bring the family in. My mom and dad happened to be up there that day. There's only 2 people allowed in the room at a time, so me and Chris were back there. And then doctors come in, and in St. Louis, they work in big teams. So it's not just a doctor. You have 5. So 5 doctors came in and told us, hey, we figured out what was going on. So I had, just immediate relief. Finally, it's been weeks. They know what's going on. And they started just saying words. Tate has EIEE, which is Ohtahara syndrome is what it is, and it's kind of what his EEG pattern looks like. So his brain activity is very low, and then it goes into epileptic spikes just over and over and over again. But they really didn't explain that. They just said Ohtahara syndrome. A couple of the things they were saying was kind of pointing me in the direction that he didn't have a great prognosis or outlook on life. But I just said, oh, okay. And actually they just left the room. It wasn't the best diagnosis delivery, I'll be honest. So they just told me that. And I'm jotting down notes on a piece of paper, they left, I start Googling, and whenever I pull it up on Google and actually read what it is that he has and the outlook, that's when life changed. And I just remember saying, we have to go find Mom and Dad. So we walked out to the waiting room, and there's families all over the waiting room. And I just remember telling them, like, he's not going to be able to get fixed. We're not going to be able to fix this. And we're trying to find a private area in the waiting room, which was impossible. So my world is crashing with strangers all viewing this. And I remember still Googling, and in the middle of everyone, I read most children die in infancy before 2 years of life. And I just lost it. Like, I'd lost it.
I can add to that some very vivid memories that I had. One of them, she came back to the room, and we were expecting to say he's going to have to take this drug or this kind of surgery or whatever. And when she told us that will be forever burned in my mind, that they cannot fix this child, is what the doctor said to her. And I wasn't really satisfied with that, so I went to the nurse's station and I said, hey, I want to meet with these doctors. And she said, do you know how hard it is to get 6 doctors together in a room at the same time? And I remember telling her, I said, they work for me. And I want them here. I want them here now. And she said, I'll do my best. And she went and somehow done a miracle and had all 6 doctors come in. And I go into the room and I'll never forget asking them, I said, are you guys sure about this? And one of them said, this lady sitting right here is one of the leading neurologists in the world. She knows the field inside, upside down, backwards, every other way. And they looked at me and they said, we have no medical answer for you. We cannot fix that child. That moment will forever be burned into my mind. But those doctors are impressive. They took the time out of their busy schedule to meet with me. I demanded that meeting, but they did that for me, and I'll always appreciate that. But those are hard words to hear. Hard words to hear. And then we decided to split up and go and call family back home. And I don't know who they called, I can't remember, but I had to go out on the balcony on, I think, like the 10th floor, and they had a little garden out there, and it's an outdoor garden. I went out there and I called Mom, and I had to tell Mom the same words that I had just heard, that they cannot fix them. And I'll never forget the stone cold look in those doctors' eyes, because they knew what we were facing. It was the most sober feeling I've ever seen. And we're talking about the smartest people in the world in that room. And they looked at us with stone faces and told us that. And I had to tell Mom the same thing on the phone. And I don't remember who you guys called.
Yeah, we all just broke it up so that we didn't have to have the conversation over and over. I remember I chose to call Brittany and told her the same thing, is he's not going to get better. And that was really all I could say. I couldn't even give her many details other than he's not going to get better.
I also remember having to come home. At the time, I was going up on Sunday afternoon after church, and I'd stay Monday and come home a lot of times Tuesday afternoon and get ready for the next week at church. And they had told us, he may not live very long at all. And when you go in the room and you say goodbye, and that could be the last time you see that child alive, that is probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And I had to do that week after week, not knowing if he was going to live one more day. And we really didn't know at that point. He was not just critical, but severely critical. And I'll never forget touching him and knowing the next time I see him, he may not be here. And you're going to have to figure your faith out when you face something like that. You're going to have to figure your faith out at where you stand and whether this Bible is real or not. That's a gut check for anybody. I'll never forget those moments in this time.
Yeah, and for me, it just felt like a nightmare. Because we didn't know what would happen, I made it our mission that we never left Tate alone. One of us would stay with him all the time, because if it was his last day or his last moment, I wanted him to have someone that he loved there in the room. So we all broke it up, did shifts. On the nights I would sleep at the Ronald McDonald house, my mom would spend the night, or Chris would come up on the weekends, but someone was with Tate 24/7. But I remember you really kind of shut your emotions off and just go numb for a while. And when I would take care of Tate, I would just be numb. But then I would go back to the Ronald McDonald House and you'd be alone, and that's when it would hit you. You'd just spend all night crying. Then you'd wake up in the morning and you would think it's just a dream. Like, it did not feel real at all. And I would wake up and I would realize, nope, we are still here. We're still dealing with the same thing again today. And, I went through the motions of that, I think, for several days, probably a week or so before things started to kind of calm down and make sense. Not even make sense, but things started to kind of come together a little bit better.
Do you have a picture you want to slide to, or you're on the right one?
I think we're on the right one.
You have anything you want to add to that, Jeannie, before we move on? I would ask you, the next question is kind of along the same lines as how did you cope with that? And there was a point there that things changed for you and how you dealt with it. And tell them about that.
So luckily that funk that I was in, that nightmare reality sort of situation, I felt like I came out of it pretty quickly, which is a good thing. I didn't stay there for too long. There was one day, that I was holding Tate, and whenever you're told that you might not have much time with your child, every time I held Tate, I would just get emotional and I would cry and cry and cry. And so one day I was sitting there crying, and actually I think it was a Sunday morning. And on Sunday mornings, we kind of had a routine where I would play church songs. And we weren't able to come to church for months. And so we would just kind of play church songs because it was Sunday morning. We were supposed to be in church and we weren't. So I would do that. And one morning we were listening to church music, and I was on Facebook, and the story of It Is Well With My Soul was, somebody had shared that story on Facebook of how that song came to be. And so before I go on in my story, I want to read to you a quick explanation of how that song was written. It was written by Horatio Spafford. He was a successful attorney and real estate investor who lost a fortune in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Around the same time, his beloved 4-year-old son died of scarlet fever. Thinking a vacation would do his family good, he sent his wife and 4 daughters on a ship to England. He planned to join them after he finished some pressing business at home. However, while they were crossing the Atlantic Ocean, the ship was involved in a terrible collision and sunk. More than 200 people lost their lives, including all 4 of Horatio's precious daughters. His wife, Anna, survived the tragedy. Upon arriving in England, she sent him a telegram and said, "I am saved alone. What shall I do?" Horatio immediately set sail for England. At one point during his voyage, the captain of the ship, aware of the tragedy, summoned Horatio to tell him that they were passing over the spot where the shipwreck had occurred. As Horatio thought about his daughters, words of comfort and hope filled his heart. He wrote them down, and they have since become the well-beloved hymn. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrow like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to know, it is well with my soul.
That song, to write those words in that instance, you just lost your family, and can you say it is well with your soul? You talk about an example of faith. That is an example of faith in the highest degree. Great song, too.
So reading that, that was probably kind of my changing, like the pivotal change in my attitude. I didn't want Tate to live a life where every time someone was holding him, they were crying. Like, that's not fair to Tate at all, for him to live a life where people are just sad around him all the time. Like, he's a baby. He deserves to be loved. He deserves to be happy with family, and I just didn't want that for him. So
it was a pivotal moment when you changed your attitude.
Right. It went from, feeling sorry for myself and feeling sorry for him to, okay, this is what we've been given. What can we do to change our attitude and make this as good as it can be?
Right. I think that's a landmark turn in any struggle that you have, when you decide, hey, this is the hand I've been dealt, and now I'm going to do the best I can do with it. And I believe that is a landmark part of dealing with any struggle in your life. So there is a shift right there in feeling miserable and sorry and why me, Lord, and all this stuff, to changing and saying, now I'm going to do the best I can with what I have. I'm telling you, when you're dealing with problems, right there's a landmark turn, a hinge for you. All right, I want to ask you this. So, what was it like planning to take him home? Because now you've got to go home. You know, you've got a fragile child, and you've got to go home, and all the difficulties about that.
So I guess first I would explain that bringing him home really wasn't on the St. Louis doctor's radar. They told us over and over again, like, kids like Tate, they normally live in the hospital. It's okay if he lives in the hospital. And that was gut-wrenching. I mean, nobody's usually told it's okay if your baby just stays here. I mean, every person I've ever met in the hospital, they're working towards discharge, and that wasn't the case with my child. They just expected him to stay.
And not only stay in the hospital, stay in St. Louis in the hospital, because they're also telling us that there's no way to bring him.
Yeah, that the local hospitals weren't comfortable with how severe he was. So we started working with a palliative care team. I don't know if you guys know what palliative care is, but it's kind of similar to hospice. It's like end-of-life comfort care. And they work with listening to families about like what their wishes are for their children and, you know, best quality of life scenario. And everybody gets to make that decision. There's no right or wrong way to, you know, go through this kind of thing. And so they really listen to like what the family needs. And so my goal for Tate was for him to have the best quality of life he could, but I wanted it to be at home. And Tate he was a little bit different than the other kids in the NICU. All the other kids were either getting worse, where, you know, they didn't have much time left, or they were getting better and they were working towards getting out. And Tate had stayed the same for a long time. We were doing the same thing over and over every single day, and he wasn't getting better or worse. And so at that time I said, you know, I really want to take him home. And so we worked really hard taking over his care from the nurses. I started doing all the stuff, having them teach me everything that they knew. And so when Tate had a medical emergency, I would not let the nurses take care of it. Like, I would do it in the hospital. And we did that so that we could prove to the team that we were going to be able to handle it at home. The palliative care team and the doctors, they did not want me to take him home. He was very unstable. They would come in every day and tell me worst case scenario. We'd have that talk over and over again. So if you can imagine being told once that your child's probably going to die, imagine having that talk every single day and having to explain to a team of doctors every single day that you know that that's a possibility.
And always advising, stay here. This is the best place for Tate, is here.
So the doctors worked in like 2-week rotations, and so one of them would come on shift, and I would say, you know, I'm going to take him home, and they're like, absolutely not. There's no way you can do it. They would spend 2 weeks with me, and they'd say, okay, we agree with you. We want you to go home and see family. And so they'd start the discharge process, but then they would go off shift. And another doctor would come in and be like, no, you're crazy, I'm not discharging you. And we would go through this over and over and over again. And so finally we just called some big team meetings, and I basically had to explain to all of St. Louis Children's Hospital that I knew the possibility of him dying, and I was willing to accept that because I just wanted to get him home to where he could meet. There were so many family members that he had never even seen and never had been able to meet. And he'd never left he'd never seen anything besides the 4 walls of a NICU room, and I just didn't want that for him. So anyway, I just told them, they offered me hospice, And now I know more about hospice, but back then I didn't, and I just was scared of that word. So I denied that, and I just told him I want to take all of the hospital equipment home with me. I'm like, I can take care of him here, so I just want the hospital equipment, but I want it to be in my home. So they finally agreed. We got to the point of leaving, packed up Tate, got him right outside of his NICU room. I mean, just had pulled him out into the hallway, and he crashed and had to resuscitate him. And I'm just trying to make a joke of it. I'm like, it's fine. He's just never been out of the NICU room before. He's just overstimulated. You know, I'm like running to the doors because they're finally letting us go. And so we load up in the car.
I have a
Respiratory tech.
His tech with me walking behind them, and she's literally crying her eyes out, and she said, "You're not going to make it. You're not going to make it home." And I kept saying, "We'll be fine." And trying to tell myself, because I'm terrified, but I'm thinking, but she just kept telling us over and over again, "There's no way. You're not going to make it home. You're not going to make it home."
So she was right. We had barely got out of St. Louis, and he was still crashing. And I was used to Tate's oxygen going low. If anybody in here has been around him very long, you know that his monitor goes off and his oxygen lowers constantly. Normally it pops right back up with me doing a few things to him, but in this scenario, it wasn't coming back up. So I'm talking Tate's oxygen levels, they've been very low, but they were like in the 60s, but he wasn't recovering. He was just staying there. And I revived him over and over and over, but he just got worse every time, and he was just limp. It got to the point where I took him out of the car seat, and I was just holding him in my arms, and Chris was driving as fast towards Crane as he could. When he got really bad, we'd jerk over on the side of the road and rip him out of the car and, do CPR on him, and Mom was trying to block traffic.
Just a second.
On I-44.
On the side of I-44 doing CPR.
And it happened not once, but probably 5 or 6 times. And we were just trying to get home. And so we got to about Rolla and pulled in at a gas station. And I said, we can't do it anymore. I'm like, Tate's gonna die on the side of the road. So we gave up. I knew that they were right. Tate was not gonna be able to stay home. We were going to live in the hospital in St. Louis. So we pulled into the Rolla emergency room. I called St. Louis and I said, send a ambulance to come get us. We're coming back. And the St. Louis team was in touch with Rolla, kind of keeping them updated. And whenever I walked out, I'll never forget, or actually the Rolla emergency room doctor came in and he said, I know what you guys are trying to do here. I know that you're trying to get home, and I'm going to help you. And so he called the local Rolla EMT team in, and they brought us an ambulance, and a team from Rolla drove us all the way back to Crane.
Do you ever wonder if God sends angels? Right here, they're in Rolla, Missouri, and this team says, we're going to get you home. Yeah, they said, we're going to get you home. They don't even know. They were going back to St. Louis. This was game over. The child's not coming home. He's going to live in the hospital. This team says, we're going to get you home. And they drove from Rolla all the way to Reavisville. Mm-hmm. If you ever wondered if God sent angels, right there's 2 of them. There's no doubt. Those came along at the exact time, the exact place. Go ahead.
Yeah, and we left St. Louis Children's early that morning, and we didn't get home until after dark. It was like 9 o'clock at night. And then had to set up all of our house. It's not just you get home and you go to bed. We had to set up our house to become a ICU room. There was all kinds of people at our house trying to get it set up to where, we could live there with Tate. And one of my worst memories from that night is we're trying to settle Tate in, and then he started projectile vomiting, and which also causes him to need resuscitated and CPR. And so we resuscitated him again, and he was finally settled down, and I remember me and Chris just laying in the nursery floor in defeat, and we're like, we're not going to be able to do this. Like, they were right. We can't do this. We are not going to be able to keep Tate home. So our plan, we made a plan that night of over the next day or so, let all the family come in. They can hold him, let's let everybody meet him. And then our plan at that time was we just want him to be in Springfield. So now that he's home, let's try to get a Springfield hospital to take him so where we can live close to Tate at least. We'll go visit him every day. We'll be with him, but we won't have to drive to St. Louis. So that was our goal. That was how we thought we were going to be living, was with our child living in the hospital.
Yeah, at that point, we had no expectation that he was going to live very long at all, and it was just a matter of could we all meet him, and just get to meet him at this point. And then we just didn't think he was going to live it long at all. But really quickly, tell them about that you had to go back to the hospital for a trach and how that was a change. That came along a little bit later.
Yeah, so somehow one day turned into another with us just trying to make it, and we got through those parts. It didn't get any easier. I'm not really sure what changed, but it definitely wasn't any easier. We were still performing CPR. The first time, I wouldn't let anybody leave me alone for a long time, so Chris stayed with me. The very first time he left the house, I had to do CPR on Tate, and Chris didn't even make it to Granny and Grandpa's driveway. So if you guys know where I live, Granny and Grandpa's driveway is, I can see it. And I had to call him, and he had to turn around in Granny and Grandpa's driveway and rush back. And he took over CPR for me and saved him. But that week, it happened over and over again. The very first time me and Chris tried to leave by ourselves, while I was pregnant and everything was normal, we had gotten concert tickets, and everyone encouraged us to go because, we hadn't been away or out of the house or away from Tate in months. Mom and my sister babysitted, they did CPR. And so it was just constant life-saving over and over. The very first time Tate got a cold, he ended up not being able to breathe on his own, and I knew we had to go to the hospital again, and they intubated him again, and that time he wasn't able to be taken off of the ventilator. Like, he actually coded in the hospital. Another time that I thought he was going to die, you can just audibly, I don't know if you've been in a hospital and you've ever had someone hooked up, if you've ever had someone hooked up to a monitor where you can hear their heartbeat, but they tried to take that tube out and he just quit breathing, and he's throwing a fit right now.
It's audible.
His heartbeat was just slowing down.
There's no describing that. There's no describing that.
But anyway, let me go to the next slide. So we ended up with that cold. We realized that he wasn't going to be able to get the respirator out. And so me and Chris had just prayed that God would give us like a clear sign that the trach was something we were supposed to do. And once he failed extubation twice and wasn't able to come off the ventilator, we felt like God had led us to feel comfortable with the trach. And so we did the trach surgery, and Tate ended up being doing beautiful with the recovery. It was actually the best he had been in his whole life. This was he was 9 months old when this happened.
Hard decision, but it was the right decision.
Yeah, it was the right decision. He did so well with it. And, Tate still has near-death experiences, but they aren't quite as often. They're a lot easier for me and Chris or whoever's watching him to intervene. And the trach has just made our life a lot differently and a lot more stable. So it's easier to help him. He is a lot more comfortable. And at this point, it's where we went from just surviving the day-to-day to after we got the trach, we started to try to live again.
Yeah, we've done a lot of things with Tate since that time. I mean, he's been out of state, he's been traveling and doing things. We've been to the beach. We've been took him sledding one day. You may have a picture of that on the left there. He's letting we've done things that you couldn't even imagine doing with a medically fragile child. And yet we've been able to pull those off by the grace of God. But I would say to wrap this up, what would you say you've learned about faith through all this ordeal?
I think there's a lot of misconceptions about being a Christian and faith. I wrote down several, so I'll kind of go through them with you. And these are just things that God has, taught us in the last 4 years. I think that we expect God, especially in this country, we think that being a Christian, that God almost like promises us the American dream. White picket fence, and you're going to have a perfect family, and your kids are going to, play t-ball, and everything's just going to be perfect. And
Ever after.
And, we really, especially in America, we just expect that almost. And that's not true. God never promised that that's the way our life is going to look. Especially it's all relative, thinking about like third world countries and stuff people are going through every day, that Christians in other countries, have a whole nother set of, issues, rather even different than this. But being a Christian does not mean that you're going to, just lead a perfect life and that God owes you that or something. Another thing is that you've heard people say, and people, try to, and I appreciate people telling, me and Chris that we're doing a good job or whatever, but, acting like we're superheroes and, God, gave Tate because you guys can handle it. Like, God won't give you more than you can handle. And that's not true. Like, me and Chris cannot handle this at all. God doesn't give you more than he can handle.
That's the key. He'll give you more than you can handle, that's for sure. But he won't give you more than God can handle. There's your answer. And
I wrote down a Bible verse that, I think of a lot, and it's when Paul tells us he was under persecution. We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received a sentence of death, but this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. Amen. So that's something that I think about a lot. Like, we aren't the ones that are able to endure this. We are only getting through it because God is the one that's handling it. And also going back to prosperity type stuff, and that God won't give you anything that you can't handle. I actually feel like it's the opposite, and I feel like as Christians we're actually called to do big things and hard things. Like, we're the hands and feet of Jesus, and Jesus led a hard life. Like, yes, he was a perfect human, but his life was very difficult. And so if we are the hands and feet of Jesus, I think that you should almost feel blessed if you're called to do hard things, that you're in good company. Because think of the greatest, in my mind, like the greatest men in the Bible are people that went through hardships. So, Job and Paul and Jesus himself. So be almost thankful that God trusts you with something that's hard, and that he trusts you to get through it and to share that. Another thing that I've noticed is, like, with Tate, people know Tate. He's kind of infamous around here, and if I had a typical child, people wouldn't know his name like they do. And so, if I had a typical child, he wouldn't have the outreach that he does. And so God, makes you go through hard things, but he has a purpose to it. And there's a reason that Tate is the way he is, because if Tate didn't go through this, then people probably wouldn't know Tate's name. Strangers would not know Tate's name. Hard does not equal bad. I've learned that joy and pain can coexist. You don't have to, just have a bad day, or, you can be happy and also be sad and going through something hard all at the same time. Don't assume that things will get easier or go away if you just believe, or if you pray the right way, or say the right prayer. I've tried it all. I know that, some people, think that if you pray the right thing, then, God will take this away from you. But I have wholeheartedly, people have sent different things from all across the world, honestly. We've gotten, before Tate's surgery, we had a prayer cloth sent to us that a church in maybe Oklahoma, I'm not sure, had prepared, and they'd all laid hands on and sent for Tate, and it was a healing cloth. And that's not something necessarily that I know to work, but if that was God's way of healing Tate, and if that was the avenue that he brought it, I was going to follow that. And so, it came to us, and I tried it. I'm like, of course, if that's the way God wanted Tate to be healed, then I was going to do it. And so I am totally open to earthly healing, but it also just isn't always for everyone. And another thing is, I think that we all feel called to pray a little bit differently. Something that we've discussed as a family is Tate is created in God's image. And as I've grown with Tate, I've come to fully accept him as who he is, and that Tate is made in God's image, and there's really nothing wrong with him. He has, he's different and he has issues, but there's nothing wrong with him. I try to help his symptoms, and I try to keep him comfortable, but I don't try to fix him anymore. Right, and so what I've told them is, I really can't remember the last time, and people might think this wrong of me being his mom, but I can't remember the last time I've prayed for total healing or complete healing. God has not laid that on my heart in years. But God has laid it on their hearts, and so it's just kind of funny how that works. God has.
But she does, and I understand that too. She's accepted it. God, I need this today. Give us this day our daily bread. That's what she prays. That's a good prayer. But me, he's going to hear about me every day, and that's what he does,
But I think that's important too, to know that everyone has their unique relationship with God, and everyone, is called to do different things. And the way I feel called to pray for Tate is different than the way some of the others are called to pray for Tate. So that's just something that, we've kind of noticed is different. I feel like early on, God gave me my answer and kind of spoke to me and kind of just assured me through prayer that this was our road, this was what our road was going to be. And I feel like God has answered me kind of similarly to Paul, that he's not, to be content, and that this isn't going to be taken away from us. So I feel like if Tate is healed, chances are it's not going to be on this side of heaven.
Bob Simpson, our song leader, he prayed almost every day until he died literally last year, that Tate would be healed. And he said, what a testimony that's going to be when everybody knows this child that he will be healed. Well, Bob passed it. It didn't happen, But that didn't mean that we quit trying. And I still am the same way. I'm going to try. But I also understand her acceptance of it and learning to live with it. So when you have hardships, you have to weigh that to yourself. What is God doing here, and how is He working in this? So everybody's right in it. Everyone's right. Go ahead.
And then I just go back, the verse that I kind of cling to is Romans 8:18.
Oh yeah.
For I consider the sufferings of the present time are not worth comparing to the glory that is to be revealed to us. And I really feel that with Tate. I mean, I almost feel like looking at him sometimes that he's it's okay, I'm okay. I have had so many times where I thought he was dying, that I've been looking into his eyes and thought, this is my last moment with him, he's dying, and it is awful, and I would never wish that on anyone, to have to look into your child's eyes and think it's the end. But there's also a peace in that moment that I cannot describe, that every time it's happened, I'm like, okay, this is it, and it's going to be okay. So
that is unexplainable. You think you're going to lose him, and yet there's a feeling there's a feeling that you cannot explain, and it's called faith, folks. Some people have it and some don't. And I feel sorry for those that don't have it. I've been on many, many deathbeds as a pastor and saw that. And I saw people have that faith all the way to their last breath. And if you ain't got that, you're in big trouble, because there's a darkness on the other side of that. But we have that, and there is a peace, just what she just said, even in a moment like that, as awful as it is.
And the last thing that I want to share is kind of my way of coping with everything. I've talked to you guys a lot about, how I've coped today, and to do this, I've had to this week dredge up a lot of these memories, and I normally don't do that. I don't live in these memories. I don't think about this stuff very often. I've almost going back through some of this stuff, I'm like, I kind of forgot about that. I bury it down deep, and maybe that's not a healthy coping mechanism, I'm not really sure. But my best advice to you, if you're going through something tough, is the reason I don't live in these memories is I can't live like thinking about these hard times every single day. I went through them, it happened to me, but we're past that now, and I have to think about the future. I can't relive the worst days of my life over and over and over again.
Yeah, we've talked about it here today for this purpose, but we don't live this stuff every day. And I told her that, you got to live looking forward. You can't live looking in the rearview mirror all of your life. All of us have a lot of pain in the past, and if you wallow in that pain, you'll be miserable. And so we brought it back today for this purpose, but this is history. And we're going to look forward, and that's just the way you got to live life in any problem that you have. I would just say that. Anything else?
I think she covered it all. I'm just moral support.
Well, I think of, how we think about Tate is like Job. We talked about him last week or 2 weeks ago, was the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Tate's not ours. We're just on loan. That's the way it is. The Lord gave him to us, and the Lord can take him back anytime he wants to. And it's the attitude you got to have. And Job said, blessed be the name of the Lord. That's the way we look at it. So I think about it in that way. And, some of the great verses in the Bible, David lost a child. King David lost an infant child. And what did he say? The child will not come to me, but one day I will go to the child. Me and Chris talked about this the other day. That child will be healed. It may be in this life, and it may be in the next life, but he will be healed. And what a reward she will have in heaven, right? The day she sees him healed. So that's what I would leave with you folks, is we have a great hope that is big. And, we live in that hope and that faith. That's what I would say. Anything else?
No, and it does make you think differently about heaven. I can't wait to get to heaven and see Tate walk
and run and play.
I can't wait.
Exactly. What a day that will be when you see him run and walk and play and do the things that a normal child. In this life, you look at him and you say, well, look at what all we've lost, I can't get up and look at him. I go fishing with Nolan all the time, my other grandchild, and we do all these things together, and you lose all that. But again, you can live in that misery, and it can run your life, One thing about Tate, he's not boring. He'll keep you busy over here. He'll keep you busy.
Sounds like he's done with the sermon.
He knows you're long-winded.
Yeah.
Well, I want to, is there anything you want to say before we end it? All right. Give them a round of applause if you will. You put them over there. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I tell you, if you would have asked any of us before this happened to us, can you handle something like this? Of course we'd say no, but you do what you have to do in life. And I would tell you that with any problem you have, there is a way to go through it. There is a way, and it's called faith. And you stand in that faith, and you get up each day, and you put one foot in front of the other. And I don't worry too much about the day after tomorrow. I worry about today. 2 Timothy 1:12, for I know in whom I have believed and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I've committed unto him against that day. It's a great verse. Learn those powerhouse verses and put them in your life, and you'll be able to handle these things. So we don't know what the future holds, and we know that it's going to be rough. We know that, but you know, this is our life. This is what we have. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to have my singers come. We're going to sing a song of invitation. And you know, I know we've run a little bit over here. We're running late. I apologize about that. Heather will never make it as a preacher. She'd get fired for that. I mean, I know to get people out on time, that's for sure. But what I want to ask you, they're going to sing a song of invitation, and if maybe the Lord spoke to you in some way. If you have a problem you want to pray about, you come down to the altar and pray about it. If you want to pray a prayer for Tate or for Heather, you come and do that. If you need me, I'm going to be here. Gesture to me. I will come and pray with you. But if you have a specific problem you want to pray about, you come down here and leave it with the Lord and tell Him you're going to stand in that faith. And like I said, if you want to pray for Tate, you come ahead. We'll take all the prayers that we can get for that baby and that child. So you come. If you need me to come down, you just gesture to me and I'll come. But let's do that.